types of sampling design. Then after actually discussing the two mainly used sampling design, random versus non-random sampling method, and their main specific maybe subparts. At the end of this chapter, I will also highlight the 10 issues related to sampling design, sampling size determination formulas, statistical formulas, how the researchers will determine sampling size. Those points will also be discussed in this part. Then let us actually start first part. I will actually start this class by simply reading a direct quotation from book Kotari, and then in this chapter of the sampling design, the book starts by simply discussing this part, and then a good sample, specifically tells the fortune or misfortune of population, whereas the bad sample will abuse the population. And then particularly the direct quotation of this specific text constant invitation many times, like BEMNET, almost about 5 or 6 invitation is already sent for one specific conference. Try to only send only one invitation at a time. Otherwise, it is quite disturbing, for which I will not actually tolerate these issues. And a good sample significantly tells the fortune or misfortunes of populations, but the bad sample will also abuse the population. That is a quotation from a book from Kotari. This part a good sample actually tells significantly the fortune or misfortunes of populations. Sorry. With this brief actually quotations from textbook, I will also maybe directly move to certain introductory issues about sampling. What is the difference between sample versus census? And why we also need sampling? That is also a point. We'll actually start our today's class. Sampling actually is a process of selecting certain representative number of elements from population, whereas census is actually a complete enumeration of all items in the populations. Yet, the distinction between sampling versus census is in census, all items are actually included, and highest accuracy will also be just obtained. It involves a great deal of time, great deal of money, energy, but the only thing, it is quite difficult in most of the case to use census. Undertaking census survey many times is not actually possible. Sometimes it's possible to obtain sufficient adequate information by studying only part of a population that is actually referred as sampling. The sampling must be also be just selecting the representative entire population through proper sampling technique. That was actually the case. That means if we apply proper sampling technique, it is possible to obtain approximately possible closer maybe result of populations. That was the case because of this fact. One thing specifically, the advantage of this taking sampling in most of the case is just it will give you a chance to save resources. The resource could be money, the resource could be time. Otherwise, in some of the cases, it's not also possible to undertake research without sampling. It depends upon the type of specific research, more or less, particularly. For instance, let us consider. Please close your specific video. It's not impossible to conduct the study without actually applying sample. This is primarily because, for instance, let us actually give you one specific example. The example is, and suppose the researcher want to maybe assess maybe to what extent the awareness of very specific program at FM radio made to the population, to the community, and that means the researchers want to evaluate. The researchers just want to evaluate specifically certain specific program from FM radio. Therefore, he actually want to design his plan, but is that possible to actually obtain the specific listener of FM program? Typically, you'll take one specific program, and then the researcher want to assess to what extent the program is just creating awareness to the community. That was his point. Therefore, we actually limited to use only. We actually limited only to use sample. It's not possible to count. In this case, it's not possible to count the whole populations. Therefore, in some of the case, sample might be actually mandatory because in situation when the total population is infinite. In such case, the only way to conduct research is through undertaking actually census, through undertaking sampling. But let's also just discuss certain point related to sampling design. What is sampling design? What are the steps of the sampling design? Then, what are the steps of the sampling design? Specifically, what are the characteristic features of the sampling design? In this part, while developing very sampling design, particularly sampling design, researchers must also pay attention to the following point. That means, in order to develop very good sampling design, the researchers must actually identify and then properly understand the following 6 main elements that are most the starting point to carry out very good design. The sampling design, the first one is type of inverse. The first steps in developing any sample design is to clearly define the inverse to be studied. Then the inverse could be finite or the inverse could be infinite. Finite inverse might be actually, let's say, the number of workers in factory. If the researcher want to carry out one specific study at one specific factories, and the total number of workers could be considered as finite. And in this case, it is also referred as finite inverse, whereas the program, which is provided by FM97 before selecting sample. And then you also need to distinguish the following two elements. What is the unit of analysis? The sampling unit of analysis may be geographical one, or like, for instance, zone, district, Kabali. And therefore, the researchers will have to decide one or more of these units might be included in the study, but the unit of analysis must be just identified at the outset. That means the researcher must identify the unit of analysis. The unit of analysis specifically to be conducted in the study. And then sampling unit is exactly the end target unit that the researchers want to select for the study. The sampling unit of analysis versus sampling unit need to also be just distinguished. That means unit of analysis is just, it will give you a very opportunity to actually get the required sampling unit. The sampling unit, for instance, to conduct one study is household. And then in order to select household, you might need to stratify or you might need to actually categorize based on certain geographical zone by zone, district, and Kabali. And this number of zone, number of district, number of Kabalis might be considered as sample unit, but the unit of analysis in this case is household. In order to actually select household head, or you might need to actually use a different type of sampling unit. The same with firm might also be just unit of analysis, or in some of the cases, even a given nation like Ethiopia and all might be actually taken as a unit of analysis. And the unit of analysis at the end of the day is need to be actually carried out by the researcher. Please switch off the video. The source list or sampling frame is also a third point that you need to actually know about the sampling design before actually designing the sample. The source list versus sampling frame. Sampling frame is just the target population you wish to research specifically, and then this must also contain all items for your investigations. The source list should be comprehensive, correct, reliable, and then appropriate. That is also the case. It's quite extremely important for resource list to be representative of population as possible. That means you need to select a very comprehensive, correct, reliable, appropriate source by supporting with secondary data. And then this, it is quite extremely important for source list to be representative of population as possible. Once, if you have this one, then the subsequent part is just to determine the sample size. This refers to the number of items to be selected from the inverse to constitute sample. And then in order to decide the sample size of sample, to be selected, the researchers must also take into the following considerations. Or the other way, while selecting sample, the researchers must also actually consider the following specific pointers. Actually, we're going to discuss separately this part. And then the researchers must also have, if you have information about population variance, if you also have the size of populations, a parameter of interest or proportions, the budget constraint, and then he will actually exactly determine specifically what is representative enough sample size. That is also the point that you need to also understand. What is representative enough sample size? Specifically, in order to select a sample from population, the minimum sample size which is allowed by the statistician is about 30. And then I will actually discuss these points later on. Therefore, maybe separately, we're going to discuss the sample size determination formulas, the minimum sample enough sample size in order to carry out an investigation should also be just discussed. This part is also discussions on parameter of interest in determining sample design. One must also consider the questions of specific population parameters, which are almost quite important. You also need to distinguish the distinction between the parameter of interest. Are you actually want to carry out statistics by simply taking from sample, or are you actually want to conduct parameter by using populations? The statistics that is just computed from statistics might also be just have its own specific meaning, and then the statistical figures, which is also computed from population, is also it is also parameter, and you also need to specifically calculate and identify your specific parameter of interest from your research. Which one do you want? Is it population mean? Is it population variance? Is it population standard deviation, or is it specifically by using sample? Other one is also the case. You also need to actually identify your specific target, and then above all, while developing the sampling design, you also need to identify. You also need to consider the cost. The cost have major impact upon decision related to the size of sample, and then the type of sample will also be actually quite determined by the budget. Therefore, while you actually developing sampling design, you also need to consider specifically the budget issues. That is also the point. So far, the discussion is almost quite maybe introductory issues related to sampling design. And then there are also certain issues, particularly that need to be considered for developing very good sampling design. This very good sampling design is actually a design that will truly represent the whole sample. That was representativeness is the first criteria of developing a very good sampling design. The sample design must also result in small sampling error, and a design that actually commit very small error is also be actually considered as a good sampling design. Even the statistician, they also actually allow this margin of error. It is need to not to extend above 10%. The sample design must also be viable in context of fund available for the research. You also need to actually determine the sampling design by actually the available resource. The best sample design is a design that is viable in context of fund, is also another point. And sample design must also control systematic bias in a better way. And that means at any cost, it is quite allowed to make certain specific bias, particularly in research, but this bias actually must be actually controlled. That means as much as possible, the researcher should not commit his bias towards to maybe designing this design. For instance, while the problem is just apparent in other institutions, deliberately, if the researcher is just select the topic and working to his specific organizations, and then we call this one is systematic bias. And then in whatever case, this systematic bias must be controlled. The researcher must be actually free from bias, personal bias. The sampling design must also result in sample study that can apply with reasonable level of confidence. That means the minimum level of confidence allowed by the statistician is between 10 to 1 level of confidence. 10% level of confidence means you are actually developing your sample design about 90% correct and 10% error. 5% it means that you are almost confident about your sampling design to bring very correct result. From 100, 95%, the remaining 5% is an error. And then this sampling design must also actually force of committing very reasonable level of confidence between 1 to 10%. That is also the case. The third types of sampling design is, the third part of this discussion is to discuss the different common types of sampling design or methods. And then let us also discuss random sample, the distinction between random sampling versus non-random sampling. Can we actually switch the distinction between random versus non-random sampling design and discuss when and how to use the various sampling designs? Also the point. That means you also need to actually have clear elaborations on each method. Subsequently, you will also going to know when and how to use these different sampling design in your research. I will also highlight this point subsequently. The type of sampling design and methods particularly could be classified in general into two parts. The first one is random sampling or probability sampling method. Second one is non-random non-probability sampling method. Non-random non-probability sampling methods, the distinction between the two is actually random and probability sampling methods is actually applying statistical methods, and it will also determine sample by giving equal chance of selecting all elements. And then most of the case, most scientific research is also use random sampling methods. Whereas non-random non-probability sampling methods, it doesn't follow randomizations, it doesn't follow statistical procedure, and then yet it will actually select the element from populations based on certain specific criteria. But that means it doesn't give equal chance for all elements for being selected on the population, from the populations. And then there are different specific methods in each part. I will actually briefly explain each matrix one by one, and for which each matrix has its own specific advantage and its own specific disadvantage. Researchers must also actually understand the merit and demerits of each specific techniques within random sampling methods or probability sampling methods. Is also referred as probability sampling methods. And then I will actually briefly explain these pointers. The major random sampling techniques or probability sampling techniques. This one is sampling techniques mostly applied by most scientific research. It will also give equal chance for all elements from populations to be included in sample. And the most common, widely used random sampling techniques are simple random sampling, stratified sampling, systematic sampling, cluster sampling. Researchers must also apply a combination of these 3, 2, or more at a time in his research. In such case, we refer to as multi-stage sampling techniques, 2-stage sampling techniques, 3-stage, third stage. That means in most of the case, you will actually use in different specific steps a combination of these techniques. I will actually, in such case, you will actually consider as if it is a kind of multi-stage, where in the first stage, second stage, third stage, and fourth stage, you will apply a combination of these techniques. And then combination of all will also be referred as multi-stage random sampling techniques. The first techniques particularly for determining first random sampling methods is actually simple random sampling. From the name itself, it is actually selecting a small sample from total population by giving equal chance for all elements in the study. In practice, simple random sampling is drawn unit by unit. You will simply actually take sample unit by unit. It might be the case in which with replacement and without replacement. That means if you observe the heart at the top, and then you will actually give certain specific names. Let's say, for instance, from this class, if we properly give the names, and then if we take one, and then that is actually, if we actually possibly draw 1 or maybe 5 students from the total 20, it might be possible. You will simply give the names for each, and then you will put on the hat, and then the individuals will pick randomly. That one is actually random sampling methods without replacement. It's not possible actually. Once if we draw the name, will not actually replace that specific selected individuals on the hat. It might be the case depending on circumstance, with and without replacement might be the case. But this is for very small sample size. But if you have very large sample element, and then in most of the case we use a table of random number. The table of random number or computer generated random number might be actually applied to select sample. The table of random number, you will actually find this table of random number from the book, from statistics book. At the end, you will actually select the required sample. And then how to also use this table of random number. Suppose I just actually bring the first specific parts of kind of sample, how to actually read random number from maybe from the table of random numbers. Or this might also be actually quite easy to observe using to do this by yourself on the maybe on the computer is also quite easy. But suppose this one is table of random number, for which you will find these numbers in the text at the end of the textbooks of these textbooks of maybe statistics. Let's say we want to actually draw maybe 16 individuals randomly. First, we will give specifically, we will determine we will actually determine or will actually give equal chance to actually select the element either horizontally or vertically. We will actually determine that by giving equal chance. Then suppose we have 100 individuals. From these 100 individuals, we want to actually select about 20. And then 100 is a digit of 3. Yes, 1 and 2, 0. That is, we will actually use this table number up to 3 digits. And I suppose we fix to take sample from horizontally. And the first individual is 5, second 7, 4, 2, 4, 2, 23. And you will actually, the first one is 100 from 100. That means you will have about the maximum of 2 digits. And the first individual is, you will allow the first individual whose number is, you select 51, 74, 42, 29, 20, 46, 24, 23, S3, 06, 21, 45, 60, 52, 25, 11. You will actually horizontally select up to the required number of samples by using this table. This technique is actually referred as table of random number. It's also quite easy to assign table of random number for computers. Using computer is also quite easy. And then you will also use either of the two to actually select the sample. Subsequent methods of random sampling techniques is stratified sampling. This is a method of selecting the same sample from the entire population by forming strata. And then if you also just observe this specific geographical area, and then you will actually divide the total populations into certain specific strata. First one is stratum A, stratum B, stratum C, D, E. And once you formed the stratum, you will select proportionally equal required number of samples from each selected strata. That was actually the case, but one thing in this method of stratification is you don't need to actually select or form strata over overlapping areas. It's not possible to actually compute strata by overlapping. Then that is actually the case. And then in addition to this, the stratifications within each strata must be homogeneous in terms of characteristics internally, heterogeneous across the strata. Strata are actually purposely formed using past experience, personal judgment of the researchers. For instance, let's say maybe you might use secondary information, secondary data to form strata, or you might also possibly made by your own specific judgments. Let's say, for instance, researchers want to actually undertake his research, and then he actually, let's say he might actually classify urban as one stratum, rural as another. And within the same, for instance, let's say researchers who want to assess saving behavior of household at Addis Ababa, he might actually identify the maybe subcities in terms of high density, medium density, low density might also be just one criteria, or you might actually use what's already just secondary information from the data. Maybe the saving behavior might be quite easy for the researchers to categorize individuals whose age is between 20 to 30. He have actually assumed to have similar characteristics for saving, and then individual was also having 32 to 45 years old, and they also have similar characteristics, and then 40 to 45, and then by forming 3 stratifications at also label, you might actually take a sample. But one thing, the stratification, the stratum internally is similar. Similar, expect to have similar characteristics, but across the stratum, there is heterogeneity. There is heterogeneous variations across the groups. That one is also the case. The third types of systematic random sampling method is sampling method is just you select certain k elements from population by actually giving certain arranging units within the entire population. And the selection of the first case unit is done randomly, and then you'll also give chance to case units then after. The advantage of this sampling technique is actually it will give you maybe a kind of uniform distributions. You will first, for instance, you will select, you will give a kind of some specific pattern. And then you will select the first pattern randomly, and then based on that, you will select the required sample until you actually find all. That means the advantage of this systematic sampling technique is it will give spread evenly over the entire population. That is also the point. That means it will give you a very good chance to have sample that will represent the whole distributions in different specific category. Another one is just cluster sampling. The cluster sampling is probability sampling methods in which you'll also select sample by forming cluster. And then this technique is also quite important, particularly to select sample. But one thing you also need to know about this cluster sampling, the cluster sampling will also form a specific subdivision from the entire populations by probably secondary informations. Then in cluster sampling, each cluster is homogeneous internally, heterogeneous with other clusters. This one is just exactly the opposite of stratifications. Homogeneity is within the cluster, heterogeneous is across the cluster. Let's say the researchers, one researchers want to actually assess the academic performance of National Aviation College students. He want to actually make this research, and then while actually developing his sampling design, he can divide the entire populations of that was actually the entire sampling units could be classified in different clusters. That means the entire student of National Aviation College student could be classified into the following clusters: postgraduate student, and an undergraduate student, and extension student could be used as one cluster. But we expect postgraduate students, they do have their own specific grading system. Therefore, the assessment methodologies to be used in postgraduates is almost, we assume, similar. But if you compare the postgraduate versus undergraduate, or if you also compare the postgraduate with extensions, that is quite different. Therefore, in this case, the formations of cluster will allow you actually will allow you actually to form or to divide the entire total number of students into 3 possible cluster. Cluster 1, postgraduate student. Cluster 2, undergraduate student. Cluster 3, cluster 3 is the third cluster is extension student. And then typically student on these different specific programs, they do have similarities internally, but the similarity is actually all postgraduate student, undergraduate student, extension students of National Aviation student program college, they are student similar, but there is difference within internally. Then if you face such kind of research, you might use clustering. The cluster formation, one thing that you note, cluster will not be actually formed by the researcher. Cluster is already just formed based on available secondary information. But in stratified sampling, the researchers by itself, from his experience, can make stratification. That was the point. The other maybe techniques is related to non-random sampling techniques. These are almost the second methods, probably is also termed as non-probability sampling methods. This method is also referred as the following, specifically non-random, non-probability sampling method is just frequently used most of the case in mass media research, or mostly is also applied in other social science fields, and then they actually made their analysis. These major types of non-random sampling methods are quota sampling, convenience sampling, purposive sampling, snowballing sampling. Snowballing sampling. And then let me also briefly discuss each of these techniques one by one. The quota sampling is a method that will also follow a specific certain criteria. The criteria might be age, or sex, or political affiliations, or religion, but whatever the case, you will the criteria, based on this criteria, we will select the required number of samples. And then the major weakness of this method is it lacks randomization. That means it will not give equal chance for all elements to be included in the sample. It will also introduce intentional or conscious error. That's also the case. That can happen due to selection of units by the interviewers is also there. Convenience sampling is also another method that will also give or will also select the required sample based on the convenience of the interviewers. Upon his specific need, he can actually select whatever he wants. For instance, near to maybe TV stations, media people, they might actually make an interview to few selected individuals, and then they actually conclude about that specific event. That means the selections of individuals to be interviewed is entirely based on their specific descriptions, based on their specific criteria, based on their convenience. And then this was actually the case, but non-probability method, which is convenient method, and purposive sampling, judgmental sampling is also the case. In some of the case, upon strong justifications, the researchers must also select population from, will select sample from populations. And then if so, for instance, the lecturers may select 2 or 3 students from class. And then these 2 or 3 students, they might also actually, in order to actually conduct certain specific opinion survey, then these 2 or 3 students might be selected based on certain specific justifications, or based on their academic performance, or based on their maybe top 3 student might be actually selected based on some specific judgment. You will select sample. Snowballing sampling is also the case in which researchers will also select the required sampling unit by simply conducting snowballing. That means first you will identify the first individual, you will contact the individual, you will convince the individual, and then the other individual will also actually invite other members. Otherwise, it's not possible to collect this kind of data. This type of sampling design is also referred as snowballing sampling. You will simply first contact the first individual, then subsequently other members, they also just invite other members. That is also the case. Let me actually give you maybe chance to raise some points on the point which is already raised. Then you may actually raise your hand.
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
Raise your hand. Okay, Slashi. Yeah.
Thank you. Probably I missed the first portion. You talked about the universe, the finite and the infinite universe. Could you study about the infinite universe? If so, how can we represent or how can we design a sample for the infinite universe?
Okay. There could be the total universe could be finite or infinite. In both of the case, it is possible to conduct research. But the only thing, the infinite case is not possible to actually know exactly the total population. Because of this, the research could be carried out by taking sample. And that means the example that we had is just researchers want to assess to what extent the specific one program, FM 97 radio, just bring specific awareness to the community. And in this case, it's not possible to count the number of listeners of FM 97 to that specific program. And we call this one is infinite, but in such case, it is quite difficult to know exactly the whole population. It's quite difficult to know exactly the whole population. Therefore, the research is just will entirely carried out by sample. You will actually take sample by from the total listeners, even though you don't have any information about the inverse. You will simply select certain sample so that you will actually undertake this. Otherwise, it's not possible. It's not possible to use statistical formula to determine sample in this case. That was the point. Any other point?
If so, what percentage of a sample
no, it's not possible
be
to determine sample
taken as realistic research? If the research is to be real, to what extent should our sample represent the study? Because in infinite sampling, we don't know the total population. We just simply take those we can find, those who can access in our hands. Really, can our study represent the total population? I mean, the estimated total population.
Yeah, we don't have actually the 100% the total population in this case, but roughly you will know to maybe to what extent this specific program is just addressed to the community. Almost you will have certain specific maybe rough estimations. Based on that, you will actually take and draw your sampling design. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to know exactly and then applying statistical formulas to determining your sample. More or less, this kind of studies is also common. In such case, the only way to carry out such kind of study is sample. It's not possible to, for instance, to conduct this kind of study, census. That means census might not be actually feasible. And then you also need to select sample by simply giving certain specific, by just assuring representativeness by giving certain specific chance for different groups. That was the point.
Thank you.
Okay, Slashi. And then any other? Any other? Any point to raise? Any question? And if no, let me also just highlight subsequently some issues related to the sample size determination formula, and so that you will also get an idea about these issues.
Doctor, can I say something?
Okay.
This is not mail. Okay. Just I want to go back to the stratified sampling, but when I see that one, I couldn't see any homogeneity on the age part, because from 20 to 30 or from 30 to 40, we cannot say simply, it's homogeneous, because in that age, maybe there is male, female, income, or any other thing. So I see the heterogeneity, not a homogeneity. So maybe how can we say this is homogeneity or something like that? So that's
Thank you, Natmael. Thank you. The question is clear. primarily, one thing you have to note in the stratifications, specifically the strata within must be homogeneous, across must be heterogeneous. The example that we had, let's say it was actually related to saving, in order to assess the saving behavior of individuals or households in Addis Ababa. If the researchers want to use such stratifications, it might be contextual to that specific topic, because individuals who have maybe younger, they might have similar type of saving behavior. An individual who have an age of maybe middle, they do have also the same, and then old individuals, they also have different saving behavior. Yes, there is also in Amharic what we call this maybe ልብ በሀያ እና ገንዘብ በ50 no ልብ
በ40 ገንዘብ
በ20 that means it goes with the behavior is just the behavior of saving goes with individual saving behavior. Yes, in such case the researchers might actually divide the age categories: younger, middle, and then old. And then if you actually carry out this kind of investigation, it's possible. Yes, for that specific typical research, it might apply. Let's say, for instance, an individual who want to actually carry out research on business firm, and then he might actually stratify the business firm in different specific categories, like wholesaler business firm, retailers, and then paid trade. Might be 3 specific stratifications might be categorized. And then we expect the business behavior in wholesalers might have similar internally, but across it might be different. Whatever the case, you have to note while you are just using the stratifications, one thing, the strata must be internally homogeneous in light of that specific topic, and then heterogeneous across strata. Plus, while developing stratifications, you have two options: to use the existing secondary informations, or to also develop a stratification based on your judgment in light of that specific topic. The situation of cluster is totally the inverse. That is the point. And then if you also have any questions.
Would you please also explain about the opposite one? Because heterogeneous, how can we also do a research, within that heterogeneity? So maybe, if you explain that also.
The opposite of this one is cluster. The cluster, which is you also need to form cluster, but the cluster is actually internally, it is now within internally, it is heterogeneous, externally or across the stratum homogeneous. The example that we had now, just researchers want to actually assess academic performance of students at Aviation International College. Now, we do have different types of students, yes, but yet a student could be postgraduate student, a student could be extension student, regular student. These are the three categories. Yet, almost the academic performance of maybe the institutions will be assessed by having student. And be it postgraduate, be it extension, almost similarity, yes? But if you actually go internally, you will also have specific sub-fields, like, for instance, postgraduate student, you do have MBA program, you do have economics program. And then it's not possible to compare the MBA program academic performance versus the economic stream. There is specific differences across specific sub-disciplines. The same with extension, the same with regular students, because some of the fields might have their own specific characteristics. Because of this, there might be up and downs, yes? Or you might take other examples, yes? But whatever the case, in this case, the stratification, the cluster must be actually formed by using secondary information. It's not possible. The researchers will determine or will actually make clustering. The clustering will be actually made from pre-existing secondary information as opposed to stratification. The stratifications might be actually made by the researcher, but in this case, it is not. That was the point. Anyone who want to actually raise? Yeah? You want to actually raise question? Shall we proceed?
Let's proceed, Doctor.
Okay. The sample size determination formula is also related with the sampling design. This is, there are certain specific points need to be actually discussed in this part. And the first part is, what are the characteristic features of good representative sample of populations? At the end of the day, if you actually properly select the sample, it's possible to conclude about population it means. And what is typical characteristic feature of good representative sample? What are the sampling errors as well? That will actually lead you a deviation between population parameter versus sample statistics. And then one thing you also need to know about in this part is how do the researchers will also determine the size of sample is also the point. The size of sample will also be determined by the researcher by using different statistical formulas. I will also give you a hint how to use those specific formulas. And a very good representative sample population might be actually drawn from population by using any of the techniques of random sampling techniques. These random or probability sampling techniques will give equal chance for all elements for being selection in sample, to be included in sample. And then if the researcher is actually applying any of the combinations of these random sampling techniques, by far it is a method that will also give good representativeness, and this is also quite, it will also help you to guarantee the representative sample. To what extent the selected sample will be representative populations if you are actually properly apply random sampling techniques, and that will also just one method. The other point is the sampling studies need to also be just deviated from population because of sampling error. The sampling error could be monitored from two sources. One is sampling error, the other is non-sampling error. The sampling error could be created due to different aspects. First one is sampling error. The sampling error is actually the error or the difference between the result of a sample, statistics, versus the result of census, the result of census, which is parameter. At the end of, if you actually undertake the whole population, and then you will actually get parameter, and then again, if you also select sample, you also have statistics. But if there is much difference between the two, and then we refer that one is sampling error. There are also maybe sample is properly selected. There will be some difference between sampling statistics and actual value. Whatever the case, the statistician, they also have specifically difference between the two. That means in whatever case, it is quite possible to approximate the population parameter. Otherwise, it is not quite possible to know exactly the whole, maybe identical result from populations might not be possible. That was the point. Therefore, as much as possible, minimize the error, which is the first part. In the other way, this difference might be also actually known to the sampling error. And that is almost common in any research. The second type of error is systematic error or non-sampling error. Non-sampling error, which is specifically an error that be actually occurring because of specifically an error which is committed from human mistake. In some of the cases, the researchers might make a bias. In such case, this type of error could be made. And the only way the researcher need to actually minimize this error is non-sampling error. Non-sampling error. There are 4 possible specific sources to actually have this systematic error. And then the first one is sampling error. The second one is accessibility bias, non-respondent bias, and then this will also constitute an addition to the error, the sampling error that was actually, for instance, the researchers just gathered the data from the sample by actually not properly implementing the sampling procedure. Or if the researcher collects the sample, the population elements might not given equal chance. In such case, it might also lead to add sampling error. Accessibility bias is also another. In many research studies, researchers tend to select respondents who are most accessible to them. Specifically, if you actually select a sample based on your specific need from one specific target, in such case, it might also lead you an addition to this systematic error. Non-response bias is also another. If you actually need to have, let's say, about 13 samples, and because of different reasons, if there is less than 30, and then because of incomplete coverage of sample, then specifically, this might also give you bias, and then what we call this non-response bias is also there. That is also the case. Whatever the case, the total error out of the sample might be classified into sampling error and non-sampling error. That was the point. The other issue is, how do we determine the size of sample? The size of sample might be actually determined based on the objective of survey, and then above all, availability of previous data related to populations. And then this information will also determine the sample. The objective survey might be actually to measure single proportion, or in order to measure single quantity, or the objective of the study might be to compare contrast between two proportions and two quantity. That is also one point. Therefore, in line of these two specific criteria based on objective survey plus availability of previous related data related to these informations, the sampling statistical formulas might have different formulas. There are specifically different formulas. And then let us also give you a formula which is mostly applied when you have single proportions. When you want to actually analyze single proportions, when your interest is only one specific interest, you also need to use this formula. For instance, the other example, in order to assess determinants of saving in Addis Ababa, and then your specific ultimate end is just to assess determinants of saving. Therefore, in this kind of study might need to apply single proportions. Single proportions, that means Z square 1 minus p times p over e squared, where the value of this value that is actually vary between desired degree of confidence. P is population proportion, E is the margin of error. If you don't have any prior information about P, let's say for instance in this case, if you have the total percentage of maybe proportions of savers, if you have such kind of information, and then you might use. Otherwise, the Kotari, the textbook, will allow you to give 0.5 as maybe if you don't have prior information for this research. This 1.96 is standard Z distributions, which will also have value of 1.96. That means the sample size will be determined using Z distribution. Then second specific formula might also be the case in which when you have variance, and then when in some of the cases you will have specifically an information about the population variance or maybe population standard deviations. If so, you will simply use these formulas. Simply this Z, which is Z normal distribution curve. The sample size will be determined using Z distribution, and then this is the value of variance. And then if you also use, and then you will actually determine sample size. Formula C is actually if you have information both proportions and the population size. If you have exactly the total number of populations to be calculated, and then if you also have certain additional information about the proportions of the study, you will use this one. N, Z square, E square. N is capital N is actually total number of population. P is probability. And if you also have probability of proportion, P, Q is the sum of P plus Q is 1. And then if you also have those, you will also use, and then this formula might also be actually applied for determining the sample from populations. And then this is what we call formula C. And then the other formula D is a formula proposed by Roscoe, 1975. This one is just a kind of rule of thumb. You will actually use as a rule of thumb to determine the sample. That means the sample size must be actually greater than 30, and it must also be based on this, must also be less than 500. And then the maximum sample size, otherwise it's not possible to complete statistical analysis if the sample size is less than 30. That means the minimum is the case, and then try to also use his table. His table, Roscoe's table is already just given. If you have total population of 290, the maximum sample, the repeated sample is 40. This is already just determined, you see. And then if you also have 10,000, and then you also need to have sample size of 248. And if 75,000, 278. This one is almost actually a table mostly applied, and then the table is just statistically determined. That was the point. And then if you also have maybe questions on the point raised to this part, that's also welcome. Let me also give you a chance. You want to actually raise pointers related to the discussions of sample size determination formula?
Can I ask us, Doctor?
Yeah, you can do.
Yeah, my name is Mogas. I want to ask a question about sampling. Actually, I was wondering that the people of Ethiopia is currently about 140 million. I saw this on world meters because of coronavirus, but the people of Ethiopia is not counted. Currently, about 10, you and me are in Ethiopian. We know that it's not taken. But census give exact figure, says people, statistician. Says that census figure gives exact figure. My question is, if I want to ask customer of a certain supermarket, customer satisfaction, if I want to ask what did, whether they are satisfied or not, how many days should I have to use? How many people are visiting a certain supermarket every day? How could I get the exact figure of telling the satisfaction of that supermarket? You can say safe supermarket, for example, or Fant supermarket, or Shoa supermarket. There are many people who are coming and going out there, but how many of them are satisfied or not satisfied? How could I take exact figure so that my company is really working well?
The question is clear for me. As you already just noted, particularly because of different reasons, the government is also extending the census, population census, in different time, and then we don't know exactly how much is the total population in Ethiopia. It is estimated about maybe only the just projection population data we have. Whatever the case, I also need to elaborate why the government is quite requiring to undertake census for population. Why not sample? That was a very important point. You see, census it will give you very accurate information, 100% reliable, correct information, and then particularly for the population data, we need to actually undertake census so that exactly we must know how much number of total populations of Ethiopian peoples. This is because this exact information is quite required for a number of interventions, particularly for political purpose, might also be the case for annual budget distributions, might also be annual budget at the end of each fiscal year will be also be made using entirely population. Or if you also observe the main macroeconomic events at national level, most of them are actually explained by using population. Otherwise, that means census will give you 100% reliable, correct information, but the problem is resource. And because of these resource limitations, most of the case, undertaking census might not be feasible. And then because of this, the statisticians, they also just recommend it is quite possible to know maybe roughly approximating result of populations by having sample. And because of this, because it saves time, it saves money, and then most of the cases not also quite convenient to undertake population for all studies. But because of this, for most postgraduate program, almost most research will be carried out by using sample. That was the point. And then if I just come to your specific questions related to maybe customer satisfactions, one typical specific supermarket, how the researchers will take this sample. Specifically, you see now the example you have is the first one is the type of universe, and this type of study is infinite. It's not possible to count exactly how much number of customers that the Pantu supermarkets have. It is quite difficult to know exactly the number of, so that let's say for instance to use this formula, the last formula, and even if you know 14, those are number of customers is about maybe 14,000, then you will right away use 269. That was the case. But the problem, because of this infinite sample might actually gets you in trouble to actually select sample size. But more or less, you will actually have the data from the supermarket, and they do have almost maybe the data over the, if you actually, for instance, if you ask them how much number of specific sale is made during this specific over the last consecutive 10 months, and then roughly they will actually give you the number. And then if you also actually use those specific informations as if it is supplementing the required customers to justify the sample, it might be the case. You see? And then you might also take specific data during the weeks, during the weekend program, during holiday, and all those might be also be differing. And then so that you will also have specific categories, even within the day, in the morning, maybe in midnight, and then in the midday, and then in the night, they do have different specific customers. Therefore, you will also have, by basing on secondary information, you will approximately determine the sample. For instance, if they do have, based on their maybe the last 10 consecutive maybe months, if the supermarket just expect the number of actually customers falls around maybe 45,000, and then you will expect to take representative sample of about 210. But how? From different specific categories, different specific arrangement. On the days, on the weekdays, or on the off days, you will actually take proportionally these numbers. That was the only way. Otherwise, it is quite difficult to know exactly and to supplement use statistical formulas. You also need to justify this selection of sample procedures on your thesis. That was Mogas.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Anyone who want to also raise questions related to maybe discussions? You may raise hands. There is an option here. If you want to actually raise pointers, you may raise hand. Otherwise, you may also directly unmute and then raise questions. Therefore, the other main point related to your maybe while conducting your thesis, and that everything which is on related to the sampling design, sampling size dissemination formulas need to be justified. You must have very strong justification, particularly for these sections, because if you actually fail to do so, the other consequences, it's not possible to make generations about the population. It means, yes, and most of the students, they actually fail to do so. Try to actually properly justify the sampling procedure plus the sampling size dissemination formulas. Techniques must be actually justified, yes. And then if you also have very strong justifications, if you also provided and elaborated on the thesis, and then that is actually quite clear. In fact, almost 400%, about maybe close to 50% of evaluation is false on this section. on sampling design, sample size exemption formulas. That was the point, yes? Try to also read this lecture note, and then I will also send you maybe additional materials just to assist you reading on this part. And then we will meet next class if you don't have any actually question. No question? Second. Yeah. You may raise second. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello, doctor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, doctor. Thank you very much. I wonder if you can give us a little bit explanation on the assignment you gave us that we are going to submit until May 31st on the problem identification. Are we going to do only problem identification, or are we going to do a kind of proposal?
No, this one is actually the questions which we already covered last class. I think if you read lecture note of chapter 3, you will have ample answer to this related to the assignment, the expectations, yes? Try to read, good. Try to also just read maybe chapter 3 handout, and the detailed issues are already just explained. And then see you actually next week.
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጎታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።